Hello and welcome to the Project Management Fundamentals. We will continue in this module with looking at the Project Scope Management area. So this is the second area among the 10. And last time we looked at Project Integration Management that brings all the other areas and process group together. So what does Project Scope Management means? So this is primarily the knowledge area out of the 10 that is required to ensure that the project includes all the work and only the work to complete the project. So be careful, look at this carefully, because you want to have all the work as agreed, all the requirement, everything that you've agreed with the customer to make sure that those work are included. But also only those work should be there. Because what happens is, if not properly managed, scope can increase or decrease. And that is why it's important to define the scope of a project and make sure that you're within the scope. And if you need to add something or change something, you should be able to monitor and control it in such a way that it goes through a change request and gets approval also via the customer. And in order to do project scope management, there are a number of steps where you go through the planning the scope itself, then collecting what requirements you need, defining the scope after collecting the requirement. You create a work breakdown structure or WBS, and then validate the scope and then control the scope. So, and each of these steps we've just mentioned falls in different process group. For example, planning the scope is in the planning phase, and also defining the scope is more in the planning as well. And things like controlling the scope in the monitoring and control phase. And that's why we said for every phase that you go through, a number of knowledge areas are applicable. And for the project scope management, these are the steps you can take. And of course, there are certain key deliverables. For example, when you're collecting requirements, you want to document those key deliverables, requirements rather, so that you can always go back to them. And when you define the scope, you should end up having a scope statement that can be used towards the customer and your project team. And the work breakdown structure is like a dictionary of what work is to be done and maybe who needs to do it, how much time. And also there should be a way of validating the scope itself, and then change requests should be managed in a good way. And that basically tells you what kind of activities to look at. So first, we plan the scope. It means we need certain inputs like project charter and management plan and some tools like expert advice and meetings or data in order to get the outputs like scope management plan and also requirements management plan. Then you can also do things like collecting the requirements, which means there are inputs you need. There are tools also you need, and then you can get the output like requirement documentation and traceability matrix. And then you go ahead to define the scope itself, create the work breakdown structure, and validate the scope while you are executing and monitoring and controlling, and then also control if there are changes that are happening. And basically with this overview in mind, you can actually be able to manage your scope in a way that you ensure that there's no gold plating where people add things that are not agreed upon, or scope creep where people do more than is required or even less than. And this is why scope management is important, and the various processes that we have mentioned are also important to be able to get a good scope. Thank you, and see you in the next video.